And today our topic is Fly Me to the Moon. And I just want to make sure you know I have personally have never been to the moon. But it all started back with the Chinese. You ever watch Mulan, where she fires off them fire rockets and it causes that avalanche to happen? So the Chinese were actually the ones credited with first starting rocketry. This guy here is interesting. He was from France. He is an author, and he wrote many books that I know you're familiar with, like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Journey to the Center of the Earth. And he wrote one that people aren't as familiar with, which was called From the Earth to the Moon. And what's interesting about Jules Verne is that in his book From the Earth to the Moon actually was a book about the Apollo program 100 years before the Apollo program was ever created. In his book, there were some men who had like a rocket society that they belonged to, and they made plans to go to the moon. They shot themselves off in a cannon, and they had a thing that looked like a cannonball that would hold 3 men, and they called it the Columbiad, which the actual one that landed on the moon was called the Columbia. And in the book, they argue over whether it's going to be launched from Florida or launched from Houston. And that actually happened in real life 100 years later. And in the book, they decided to launch from Florida. And in real life, that's what happened also. So that was kind of cool. This man was the first American that actually is credited with starting rockets in this country. He started out just launching rockets out of his backyard, and he created like a society of men who kind of had a hobby of rocketry, and so he's called the father of modern rocketry. You probably heard of this guy, Wernher von Braun, if you've ever watched the show October Sky. This is the guy that Homer Hickam wanted to meet. He's the boy that created, him and his friends made a rocket and entered it in a science fair. You've probably seen that movie before. But Wernher von Braun was actually over the German rocket program, and he had a big laboratory with several scientists that worked under his command. And at the end of World War II, our soldiers were going to his laboratory, and Wernher von Braun, along with his men that worked with him, walked out and met our soldiers, and they were brought back to the United States. And they actually were working in our space program, and Wernher von Braun became the head of our space program in this country. And later on, he became the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, which is where I actually worked. Wernher von Braun started working with Robert Goddard. They were at White Sands Missile Range. And in this country, we were practicing with monkeys. They were sending monkeys up, not all the way into outer space, but just up into the upper Earth atmosphere, and then trying to get them retrieved back down safely using parachutes. But this one down here at the bottom, right here, she was the first successful monkey that went up, and they were able to get her back alive. There were also mice down here in the chamber down below. Now, while the United States, was trying to launch monkeys, the Soviets of Russia were launching dogs up in their rockets and trying to retrieve them back down by parachute. The French also had a program, but they were using cats over in France. Then in 1957, you probably heard about this in school, the Soviet Union sent up the Sputnik. Came flying over. I was just a year old back then. It came flying over the United States. It did have cameras on it where it was able to photograph our military bases as it came over. And so it put a lot of fear into the hearts of Americans, especially since we didn't have this kind of technology in our country. And just a month after that, they sent up this dog right here, Laika. She went up into a satellite that orbited around the Earth. Well, in response to the Sputniks, this is our president, President Eisenhower, and he created the organization of NASA back in 1958. And when this organization was first created, this was their mission statement: to improve life here, to extend life there, and to find life beyond. When NASA was created, they actually believed there was intelligent life out there in space. It was just a matter of finding it, and it was actually part of their mission statement. This was the first Russian human that was put up into space after they were able to put up Laika, the dog. A few years later, they sent this man into outer space. He orbited around the Earth, and then he came back down safely. The Russians did not splash their astronauts down into the ocean like we do, because there is no ocean really near Russia. It's kind of surrounded by land. And so Russia brought theirs back down by parachute. And after Russia was able to do that, President Kennedy, who was president at the time, actually had this wonderful idea that we were going to put a man on the moon in 10 years. And most people thought he was absolutely crazy, because we weren't even getting a man up at all. We weren't even getting our rockets out of the Earth's atmosphere yet. And here President Kennedy stepped up and said, we're putting a man on the moon in 10 years by the end of the decade. And what he did is he set guidelines for them, and he started putting dates on them about when certain things had to be accomplished. And so the program started moving very quickly. This little monkey here was the first chimp to actually go up and orbit the Earth and come back down. They splashed her down into the ocean in good condition. And so when they were able to do that, they sent this man, Alan Shepard, up. Now, he didn't go around the Earth, but he went up into the outer atmosphere, what we would call outer space. He went up, and then they brought him right back down and were able to splash him down into the ocean and retrieve him safely. So the next step was this man, John Glenn. They sent him up. He went around the Earth and made his orbits, and then they were able to bring him down and safely retrieve him. The Russians were still at it. They sent the first woman up into space. And the French were starting to have a little luck with their cat. And they finally got their first cat up and retrieved back down to Earth. Its name was Felix. This is where we lost our first Americans, was on the Apollo 1. It was the first one that they built. And on this one, they were actually just doing like a dress rehearsal to see how everything was going to go. So it was still on the launch pad. It was not intended for it to launch. They were just checking things out. And the guys were inside of this capsule right here. And the capsule caught on fire. And they couldn't get the door open. The guys couldn't open it. It opened inward, and there was something wrong with the hatch, and they couldn't open it, so they couldn't get out. And if you read the reports even from NASA today, a lot of them will say it was caused by a spark. But what they found out is that when they went to check, they couldn't find where a spark had actually started, or where the fire had started for sure. But Velcro was a relatively new product on the market back then. It had been created about 10 years ago, but nobody really used it. But NASA found it very helpful for like holding wires and cables and things like that. And it was holding cushions inside, like the seat cushions on their seat. And they were using it on the flaps of their uniforms. And inside of the capsule, they would put oxygen in there for the astronauts to breathe, because it helped to eliminate stress, make it easier for them to breathe. But what we found out is that Velcro, who knew, right? But Velcro will spontaneously combust when it's in a pure oxygen environment. You could take Velcro, put a little of it in a container like that, put a couple of drops of oxygen on it, and it will burst into flames like that. And that's what most people feel like caused that fire. Other missions of the Apollo is where we were learning what we needed to know to be able to go to the moon. They practiced things like using tools, making repairs, doing spacewalks, docking, and just being able to maneuver the spacecraft different ways. Those are all the things we were learning in the Apollo program. And then when they felt like they were really ready to go to the moon, it just happened to be this crew's turn to go up. This was the Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong he's over here on the far left. And then in the middle here is Michael Collins. And over here is the one they call Buzz Aldrin. And this is a very controversial picture. This is Neil Armstrong on the moon. And a lot of people look at that picture and say, well, that's impossible, right? Because that flag is waving and there is no wind or atmosphere on the moon. But this flag was designed for this purpose. It has a metal bar up here at the top so that it doesn't just, hang down. And they wanted it to look like it was waving. And so it was actually sewn this way. So it would actually look like there were waves on it. Now, there are things about this photo that are not true, because when NASA takes photos, they do not take them in color. So anytime you're looking at a photo and it's in color, it means it has been enhanced. They go back, they try to clean them up, they try to make them as clear as possible, and they enhance them with color. Even when you're looking at pictures of like the stars and things like that, or the planets, and they're in beautiful colors, those have all been enhanced. That is not the way they look in real life. So you have to remember that. This is Buzz Aldrin on the moon, that same mission. And Neil Armstrong took this picture. And when people look at this picture, they're like, well, look at his helmet. Look at his face. See that right there? That is the cameraman in there. No, that was his camera. This is what the camera looked like. It was a tripod. And this camera is still up there on the moon. They did not bring it back with them. There's all kinds of stuff that is up there on the moon, and that is one of those things that got left behind so that they could bring rocks back with them. There have actually been 12 Americans that have walked on the moon, not just 2, but we've actually been there several times. This is David Scott. He was on Apollo 15, and I wanted to show you this. Yeah, and there were also other countries that had space programs. It wasn't just Russia and the United States. There was Germany, there was France, and there was Argentina. And one of the arguments people make about we didn't go to the moon is that they see objects laying around on the moon that look like they're man-made. And they would probably be right about that, because all of these countries were launching things up there, and they were like crashed. Some of them crashed accidentally. Some of them were purposely crashed. So these were things, these 2 over here on the left side, those were from the United States. This one here was a rover that they said, or a lander, and this one here was an impactor, and it was designed to actually go down and hit into the surface so that they would know whether it was a safe place to land or not. These other 2 were ones that the Russians were sending up. But Germany, France, and Argentina were all sending things up around the moon. Other countries also assisted us. Canada, Switzerland, Australia, and Germany. And Australia was really important because when the Earth is rotated this way, Australia was the main country that was able to communicate with our astronauts. We lost contact because we are on the other side of the world. So Houston wasn't able to communicate with them. We didn't have the satellite systems that we have today. And so we had to rely on Australia to be able to communicate with our astronauts while they were up there on the moon. So other countries know we went to the moon. Now, this is one of my favorite arguments when people say, you know, it was all fake, is that we didn't even have the technology in our country to be able to fake it. This is the best Hollywood had to offer. Doesn't look a thing like the NASA videos. And this was the best Hollywood could do back then. Doesn't look a thing like the Apollos, does it? And this is my favorite part here. He's supposed to be on Mars. And watch him. He lifts his helmet. We didn't have a clue what was on other planets back then. And this was a TV series that was going on. It was called Lost in Space. And it's about as dumb as it gets. But this was also a Hollywood type production. So this is what we thought it was going to look like on other planets whenever we got to places like the moon or to Mars. And this was a very popular movie. Now, this is as close as we could have got, would be something that looked kind of like that. But even then, it doesn't look quite like the actual footage that they were able to take on the moon. Okay, so I wanted to show you just a little bit about the actual landing. This was when Neil Armstrong was actually coming down, and some people say, well, who took the pictures? Well, they did. There were actually cameras that were part of the landing gear itself that they would like extend out, and they would be able to film him as he was coming down the ladder. This was the Apollo 13 crew that the movie was made about, and this guy right here in the middle is the one that Tom Hanks played his part. And so these were the guys that went up. They came back alive, but they didn't get to actually land and walk on the moon. Now, this was me when I was little, right here. My mother was very sick, so my dad had to take most of his money that he made and use it for hospital and medications for my mother. So as I was growing up, as I was always working to help support my family, this is not me, and that's definitely not me over here. But these are things that I used to do before I got old enough to have a real job. I would like steam clean people's carpets. I would do ironing. I would mow lawns. I would pull weeds, anything I could do to help bring in money for my family. When I was your age and I turned 16, I was able to get a real job, basically. So after school every day, I worked at the public library for 2 hours. And then I had a job as a waitress at a big boy restaurant place where I would work until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. I'd go home, get a couple hours sleep, and go to school and do that all over again. And I saved my money so that I would be able to go to college. And in 1976, I went to New Mexico State University. I had enough money to pay for 1 semester and 1 semester of a dormitory room, and that was about it. And so while I was trying to figure out what I was going to do to get money for college, I found out about this program. It's an internship program where you work 6 months and go to school 6 months, and you work 6 months and you go to school 6 months. Back then, they called it Cooperative Education Program, but right now they're just calling it an internship program. And so on that program, they allowed me to apply at 4 different places. So these are the 4 places that I applied. They gave me a whole big list, and I was able to choose which ones I wanted. So I picked the USDA, which is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I picked NOAA, which is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association. I picked Hunt Wesson, and I picked NASA. But when I interviewed with the USDA, they wanted me to change my major to entomology and to study the mating habits of insects. So I was like, nope, I'm not doing that. When I interviewed with NOAA, they only wanted people who had 20/20 vision. And I have trouble with my eyes kind of move in different ways. And so they were not interested in me at all. Hunt Wesson, I don't know why they didn't say it earlier, but they only wanted people who had a 4.0 average. And at the time, I had like a 3.75, something like that. And so they were off my list. So NASA was like my only hope. And this was the campus where I was going to school at New Mexico State. At that time, it was the largest campus in the United States, acreage-wise. And I was on campus. We didn't have cell phones back then. So everything was word of mouth. And I heard somebody yell across the campus that the guy from NASA is in the engineering building. And so, boy, I took off and I was on my way to go to the engineering building. And when I got there, there was a guy inside who was talking to a whole bunch of people. And as I walked through the door, they put a brochure into my hand. And in the room, I was the only girl. There were all these guys, and then there was me. And so I was in this room with all these people. And the guy at the front was saying, okay, if you could hear me, I want you to be in Huntsville, Alabama at Marshall Space Flight Center, January 6th. I will see you there, right? And I looked around the room, and I thought, he doesn't even know who he's talking to. You know, so I thought, okay, that's kind of crazy. But I went home. I was actually, Las Cruces is over here, and I grew up in Hobbs right here. And when I went home for Christmas, I told my folks, well, it looks like I have a job working for NASA. And I took off to go to NASA, which is all the way across the country over here in Alabama. That's where the Marshall Space Flight Center is in Huntsville, Alabama, over there. I didn't even know if I was going to have a job for sure when I got there. But I got me an apartment with the little bit of money that I had left after I got there. And I went to NASA for my first day on the job. I got there. All I had was my little brochure that they had given me. I had no letter of confirmation or anything. So I showed them my brochure, and they sent me over into a building. I'm sure this is not the same building because this was like 50 years ago, but it was a building like this. And I walked in, and there was myself, there was one other girl, and then a whole room full of boys. And they swore us in. We raised our hands. We took our oath to the United States. They took us in. They fingerprinted us. And then they took us on a tour of the Marshall Space Flight Center, which is huge. It's part of Redstone Arsenal, and it encompasses all of that you can see in this picture, and about that much again. It's a huge, huge place. And since there were only two girls, they took us around together. And you travel in like a taxi cab. You don't drive your own vehicle. Every building has like a phone in the front of it, where if you need a ride, you just pick up the phone. It directs you directly to a taxi cab service, and you tell them where you are and where you want to go, and then they come get you and take you wherever you need to be. And so we were being ushered around in one of those taxi cabs, and the girl I was with, she chose one of these buildings that looked like this to work in. But these were a little fancy for me. I was kind of more of a homegrown, country girl. And so working in a big building like that really didn't interest me a lot. And I wound up in a building that looked something like this. It wasn't this building. This is just the closest thing I could find to it on the internet. It was actually a huge complex with lots and lots of hallways, but it just kind of looked like a barn. And I thought, yeah, I can work here. This is my kind of place. So this is where I wound up. And they had an office area inside where all their scientists and engineers would work. They put me in the middle of all of this. And guess what? They put me over the coffee pot and the crossword puzzle. It was my job to watch the coffee pot and make coffee, and to make sure everyone got their crossword puzzle every morning. And I thought, if my dad knew this, he would die, because he told everybody, my daughter's going to work for NASA, right? And I'm making coffee and passing out the crossword puzzle. So this man right here is not my boss, but my boss looked very much like this. He always sat at his desk and smoked pipe. And he wasn't there very often, but I went in one morning early to make the coffee, and I noticed he was in there and his door was open just barely. And I thought, I'm going to go talk to him about this because this is driving me crazy. And so I barged into his office and I started pounding on his desk, and I said, Dr. Goss, you give me something pertinent to do or I'm going home. I did not come 1,200 miles across the country to make coffee and pass out crossword puzzles. And a voice from behind me said, "My God, Ray, give that girl a job." And I turned around. It wasn't these guys, but it was some guys like this. There were a couple of generals and some men from the Redstone Arsenal. They were all in that room for a meeting. And they had come to figure out where they were going to get the help that they needed back in the laboratory. And I had just walked right into that meeting, and it was just good timing as far as that goes. And so they put me with this lady here to work with, Ann Fight Whitaker. She happened to be a candidate to become one of the first women astronauts. And she had actually worked on the Apollo program when they were getting the men to the moon. And so I started working with her. This is her here in the front. And this is over here. This is Mary Helen Johnston, who was she was into like metallurgy type stuff. And this is Carolyn Greiner, who was into materials evaluation. And both of these ladies were actually training to be pilots as well. And so all of them were candidates to be among the first women astronauts. They were also the only 3 women at the Marshall Space Flight Center who weren't like secretaries or custodians. The ratio of men to women in those days at the base was 1,000 men to every 1 woman that worked in those positions. So not very many women involved in science back then. This is them in their training uniforms where they were training to become astronauts. And at that time, the shuttle had not flown yet. It was in its early development stages, and it was basically mostly just a picture on the drawing board. And it just so happens that I wound up carpooling with a couple of the aerodynamic engineers that had helped to design the space shuttle. And they would argue back and forth to work every day on to whether or not the thing would even be able to fly. Because it was kind of like a bumblebee. It was really fat here, and it had really short wings out here on the side, so there wasn't as much air resistance when it took off. And they didn't think it had a hope of actually flying. But within a couple months, this is a cargo bay. Some people don't realize this about the shuttle, but the shuttle was actually used to like take things into space and to also collect things from space. We have a lot of garbage and stuff out there in space. And so the shuttle kind of helped us clean up a little bit of that garbage that's out there. And this is how they tested it. The first test they did on it was actually at Edwards Air Force Base in California. But they also did this test. This was a picture from the Redstone Arsenal, which is right by Marshall Space Flight Center. And they would take it, put it on a 747 jet, and then they would push it up into the air like this. And then the jet would drop out from underneath it, and it would glide back down onto the runway. Another thing that I did is they put me back in the lab, and I tested a lot of the materials that went into the actual space shuttle. And this amazed me about NASA, because I thought, hey, it's NASA. They're going to have state-of-the-art equipment, right? No, they pull stuff out of the storeroom that looks like it's 100 years old or more. And this is what they built this out of. This particular thing here had like a little opening where this would open. It had a wire coming down here with a little tiny pan, which was a balance on it. And I would have to open this up. I'd cut a little bitty sample and take real long tweezers and stick it right inside there and then close it back up. And then I would pull a vacuum on it, and we would see what kind of gases actually came off of it. And we would heat it and do that. This big old nitrogen dewar over here was filled with liquid nitrogen, and we had to use it to keep the pumps cool, because when you're running a vacuum system like that round the clock 24 hours a day, the pumps get very, very hot, and we would have to cool them with liquid nitrogen. This right here was a panel that would actually record the temperature. And this up here went to the little scale and would tell me the weight of the sample and how much it had lost. This is actually me right here, and I'm running a scan on it with a gas chromatograph. that would tell me what kind of gases were actually coming off of it. And as it was running, I would have to put down here what time it was or the temperature at which it was coming off at. And this thing had to be operated 24 hours a day. And when I first put the sample in, I had to run a scan every 30 minutes for the first day. And then after that, I could run it like once an hour. And this is me. They would take me around sometimes when they would go to the schools, the elementary schools, and we do presentations for the kids. And so here I'm actually wearing one of the flight suits. And this is Ann Whitaker that I was working with. She was making the presentation. And this guy back here was in charge of all the space suits at the Marshall Space Flight Center. The astronauts have like a set of suits at every single center where they train. And this guy was in charge of the ones that were there. And this is a real spacesuit that they put me in. It is not a costume. And they would fit me up with that spacesuit while they were explaining what goes on and all that good kind of stuff. And this is the man whose spacesuit that I would wear because he was short. This is him over here, Pete Conrad. He is one of the men who walked on the moon during Apollo 12. And so him and I, we were pretty close to the same size. And so I used to wear his training suit. My supervisor would also take me to meetings with her. And in our facility, we had a room that had a big old huge table like this. And usually we would sit like over here and she would be right beside me. And we had a policy between us that I was not allowed to say anything. I could not ask questions. I could not express an opinion. I had to sit there and just keep my mouth shut. She gave me a clipboard and she would let me like write down, questions that I might have, and her and I would talk about it later. But while I was in the meeting, I wasn't allowed to say anything. But this was the very first meeting I went to. It was so confusing. It was like crazy. This was an idea that was, on the board. And I want you to look at these words up here: solar sails and solar cells. And so they kept talking about the sails and the cells, and I got confused which one they meant. But the great big thing that's out here that looks like a kite, that's the solar sail. And then on these panels down here in the middle of it, those are the solar cells. And this thing was supposed to float out in space, right? And then it's supposed to reflect the sun rays back onto the cells so that they can produce more energy. Now, this was back in like 1977 when this was on the drawing board, and they actually got around to using it in 2010. I always thought they were kind of crazy for even wanting to do this, because I'm like, anything that's out there that bumps into it or whatever, it's a goner, because it's like really super thin type material. And but they had some success, not as much as they thought. So I don't know if it's a technology they'll be continue to use or not. This was the one that intrigued me the most, is that they had a plan back in the 70s to build a space colony in outer space. And this colony was supposed to hold something like 11,000 people. And it was going to have places where you could actually grow gardens and food and houses that you could live in. And it was going to look like a wagon wheel like this. And it was going to spin. And by spinning, it creates artificial gravity so that you feel just like you do here on Earth, except you're in this wagon wheel thing. And they were going to create things where you could actually travel from one colony over to another, back and forth. And I thought, this is the craziest thing I ever heard, because it reminded me of a cartoon that was popular back then called The Jetsons, where they had buildings and stuff that were just floating in space, and they had little vehicles where the family would travel back and forth. And they had a robot that would clean the house for them. And they even had these video things, which we thought this would never happen back then. Nobody had computers in their home. But this was a cartoon of the day, long before cell phones and Zoom came on the scene. And they had these things right here were like traffic jams in outer space. And so this is something you actually may kind of see happening in your day. One of the things that the Space Flight Center was famous for was their vibration testing. And they had this tower over here, and they were actually able to put something like the space shuttle in it. And then they would basically, they could fire the engines to see how much vibration came off of it, or they could even shake the mess out of it. And so that's one of the things that they would do at the Marshall Space Flight Center. And while I was there, the shuttle was actually several years behind schedule. And one of the problems they were having is the engine was catching on fire. And the lady that I was working with, she was in charge of what's called the shaker table test. And we had a facility that looked kind of like this. And there was a big round table, and they put a mock-up of the shuttle engine on top of it. So it looked something like this. They sat me at a little desk that was out here and gave me a clipboard, and they told me they wanted me to make observations about things that might fly off of it, funny sounds it might make, any kind of a smell that I might notice. And then they all disappeared. I turned around, and they were in an observation room with bulletproof glass, right? So I called my supervisor over, and she says, "Is something wrong?" And I went, "I want to know why I'm here and everybody else is behind the bulletproof glass." And she put her arm around me, and she, kind of leaned over real close to me, and she whispered in my ear. And she said, "Honey, it's because you're dispensable." And at first I was like really proud. And then I realized what she said. You're dispensable. In other words, we can afford to lose you, and it's no big loss, right? And so I'm like, I don't think I like this too much. But they, we did the test and nothing went wrong, and I survived, and it was okay. I no longer worked at NASA after about 1979, 1980 in there. And then the space shuttle actually launched. It was called the Columbia, was the first one that they actually sent up into space. These are the two men that flew it. The very first time it went up, it only had 2 people on it. After that, I think it always had 7 to my knowledge. And when it was coming in for landing, it was designed with a parachute system, but I don't think they used this very much. I think they found they really didn't need it. Usually by the time it got to where it was going, it had slowed down enough that it could land safely without the parachutes. The third time they flew it up, they landed it at White Sands Missile Range. And this old fella over here happens to be my brother-in-law. And at the time, he was over the optics division, but he had been a co-op student like I was, working in the internship program, and he managed to work himself up to be the second in command at White Sands Missile Range. But these trucks down here were the ones he was in charge of at the time. He had several people working under his command, and he had lots of equipment. And when the shuttle came in for its third landing out there, they took all kinds of pictures of it, thermal pictures, regular optical pictures, so that they could see where the weaknesses were on it. And they were able to make the proper repairs to it. And then they sent it back to Florida to be relaunched again. These were the ladies that made the final cut to be among the first women astronauts. And unfortunately, the 3 ladies that I worked with did not make that cut. This was the first woman who went into space, Sally Ride. And this was the first African American that went into space just a couple of months after that. This lady right here, this is one of the ones that I worked with. She did make it as an alternate for one of the shuttle missions, but her group didn't have to go up. And so she never got to make it into space, to my knowledge. This is one that you're probably familiar with. This was the first civilian, the school teacher that went up. This was her right here. And this one here is the one that exploded on takeoff. And what is interesting about this is that just a few days ago, November 10th this year, there were some scuba divers down off the coast, just off of Florida, and they have actually found some large pieces of what they think is the Challenger down there. They said it's about a 20 or 16 by 16 type that they could see on the surface, and then it seems to be buried down under the ocean. So they're going to be digging this thing out in the very near future. So they may get a little more information about what really happened when that thing blew up. This is the one that we lost that came apart over Palestine, Texas. Most of your parents probably remember this one because it blew apart on Palestine, and it was going so fast that it left debris all over the east side of Texas. And a lot of people were picking up parts and pieces off of it, like out of their backyards and stuff like that, and out in the woods and places like that. And after this happened, they decided to terminate the shuttle program because the vehicles were just getting too old to continue to fly. They flew a few more missions after that, but not too many. These were the shuttles that they had made. This one over here, the Enterprise, never went into space. It was only used for testing purposes here on the planet Earth. The Columbia and Challenger were the two that blew up, and these three over here are still intact. And they are at different locations around the country. But altogether, over a 30-year period, they flew 135 missions with the space shuttle. And this is where they're located. Those four that are still intact there's one in California, one down here in Florida, and then there's one up here, it looks like in Maryland, and one up in New York. And this was the woman that I worked with directly. She was my boss, and she is retired now, but she worked her way all the way up to become the head of the science directorate at the Marshall Space Flight Center. And this is the other lady, Carolyn Greiner. She started out as a co-op student like I did and worked her way up to become deputy director of the whole Space Center. When Obama became president, he announced that we would be sending humans back to the moon by 2020. We didn't quite make that deadline. And also that we would be sending humans to Mars by the mid-2030s. But that didn't happen. Under Obama, he cut back the spending of NASA severely, and most of the parking lots and stuff just looked like ghost towns if you visited the Space Center. When President Trump came into office, he signed a bill that just made it official what Obama had said. Obama had said we would go back to the moon. And so President Trump, he signed a bill to make it official so they could receive the funding that they needed to make that happen. And he also signed a bill to create the Space Force. And a lot of people felt like, well, we don't need that. The Air Force already, takes care of us that way, and the Army. But right now, a lot of people don't realize it, but there are over 4,500 satellites out there, active satellites out around the planet that are out there orbiting around. And also we have asteroids and things like that come into our planet and are a threat to our planet. So it's probably a good thing that we have something in our military system specifically for outer space protection. So NASA we know Mars rovers right up there. They've had a lot of problems with that rover, but it's been collecting samples. But now we got to figure out how do we get those samples back to Earth. So NASA is working on this, which is a little thing they're going to send up that's supposed to get the samples and then bring them back to the Earth. But it's projected to launch around 2028. So they're working on that. And once they get it made, it takes 7 months to get it to Mars and 7 months to get it back. The International Space Station is still going. It's been up there since 1998. There are 15 different countries involved in that. This was a recent photo they sent back where they're actually trying to grow like tomato plants and stuff like that up there right now. They intend to keep this thing going until 2030, which I think is a little bit too long to have something in outer space. That would be 32 years, and I certainly wouldn't want to be on it when it's that old. This is new this year, the James Webb Telescope. And remember, when they take pictures, these pictures are in black and white, or they're thermal images, and then they just come back and add some color to them to make them look pretty. This is part of the Space Force that we've created. They work with NASA, and they're actually practicing blowing up asteroids that are out there that are not a threat to the Earth. But so that if we do have an asteroid or meteorite or something coming toward us that could threaten our planet, then hopefully we'll have the ability to blow it up before it gets to us. This is a new one. This just happened recently. We're sending probes to the sun. It supposedly has gone closer to the sun than we've ever been able to go before. And this thing just launched November 16th this year. This is our new program to go back to the moon. They're calling it Artemis. And there's going to be several of them. This was Artemis 1 that took off. There are no people on it right now, but they do have a couple of these mannequins that look like this. And the article I was reading said it had robots. And I looked for pictures of what kind of robots may be on it, and I could not find anything. So I don't know what kind of robots they have put up there. But there are several other things that are on there. They have a Snoopy. They have some Girl Scout badges. They have some Lego minifigures. They have some tree seeds. And they said in thousands of mementos that are on board. This is what the Snoopy looks like that's on it. That should say as right there. This is Snoopy as a zero gravity monitor. That's the Snoopy that is on board. And the next launch, the next time it goes up, is supposed to be 2024, just in a couple of years. And the first crewed landing is scheduled for 2025. And that first landing is supposed to have a woman on it. They're going to put the first woman on the moon. And these people are the crews, people that are selected to serve on those crews of those missions going up. And these two ladies here are first in the running right now to be the first woman on the moon. And then the article I was reading said they also plan to put a man of color at that same time, but I don't know what they mean by color. I don't know if they mean African American, or, if they consider Orientals also, or Hispanics to be people of color also. I don't know. I always thought I'm kind of pink myself, that I have a color too. So, Anyway, these are those ladies. They currently serve on the International Space Station. And they have, wouldn't you love to live like that? Boy, that's just, I can't imagine people living up there that long in that kind of an environment, but that's the way they live on the International Space Station. Very close quarters, lots of wires everywhere. This is one of those ladies that are out making the walk around it and making repairs to the International Space Station. They actually made a walk which was 7 hours and 17 minutes long, so they're very experienced at being in space. And this is the main goal of the Artemis program. They're actually going to put a colony on the moon. That's the idea behind it. And those people will actually live up there for long periods of time. And the European Space Agency, this is their projection of what the first moon village ought to look like. Now, it's interesting that Elon Musk, who is with SpaceX, he owns SpaceX. SpaceX works very closely with NASA now and helps us to launch these things into space. But recently, he has put these civilians up into space. And what is unique about these is there was no astronaut with them. It was just them on board. They actually went through like a little bit of training, and then they launched them into outer space. Pricey. The price per ticket to go into outer space through SpaceX or other agencies is anywhere from $275,000 to $55 million a ticket. However, all meals are included in that. This is another thing that SpaceX has that they're working on right now. It's very similar to the shuttle in that it's going to be a reusable vehicle. They are going to be able to retrieve it and to land it the same way the shuttle is. It's going to be able to pick up things, and take things with it, but it's much smaller than the space shuttle. It's about 1/3 the size. And this is what it looks like on the outside once they get all of the, insulative material and everything on it. And that is the end of my presentation today.